on and begin playing with in your life. Another thing that supports me in it is really doing the repair work and the debriefing with other people differently. And I don't expect myself, at least in what are challenging situations for me, to apply it perfectly in the high stakes moments. I want to develop the inner resourcing, and I want to develop the capacity to be effective in an increasingly complex and wider range of situations. But for me, that also means knowing my limits. There are some situations and some people with whom I find it very easy to both speak and hear empathically. So for example, in the work that I do, if I'm sitting in my office with a client, it's really an easy frame for me to slip into. I tend not to get super triggered by whatever is going on. But at home with my husband, when we're going to have the same argument that we've had for, X number of years, it's as if suddenly I have no skills in this situation. And so that's really about me knowing my capacity, honoring my limits, and developing the skillfulness sometimes with Brett to say, I'm finding that I can't listen or feel any empathy right now, and I need an hour off to go and figure something out before I can continue, and that would be good enough. Does that at least address a piece of it? It doesn't help you necessarily not go into the paralysis. I think my quick answer to that would be, if you could find a way of enjoying the paralysis, you'll be on the right road. Right? If you can find a way of observing it and feeling some curiosity about it and having a need for some growth and movement and requesting of yourself some humor and playfulness with this place of paralysis that human beings can get into, you'll enjoy that internal space in a way that is different. Okay? Anything else on any of those?
Well, I don't know if this is in response to your question, but for myself, I guess I'm one of the dinosaurs around here. So I grew up with PET. How many of you know PET?
Yeah. Parent effectiveness training.
Where you have a communication window and you try to make it overlap as much as possible. And so I'm always used to trying to help do my bit about making it bigger, so the window bigger. So I'm always looking, well, can I do it this way? And so it's somewhat different concept than what we're talking about here, where you analyze your needs. I mean, I guess in a sense, even the PET relates to your needs by saying, well, what can I live without, or can be without, really? The inverse of what your needs are.
It's really common. I remember this when I began working with this model, that I went, oh, you mean my feelings are valid? I get to actually talk about my feelings? Woohoo! I'm going to feeling all over the place now. And not only that, but you mean I have needs and I get to honor the needs and they're the same needs as everybody else? And so all of a sudden, I'm presenting everybody with opportunities to meet my needs because I have this idea now that my needs have to get met. And if you are like me at all, what I would, if I can save you any of the learning or at least show you that this may happen, you learn, at least I think I have gotten to a place where I'm very comfortable with my needs not being met. That in a way, that resources me for dialogue. That I can be aware of the fact that I have a particular need. That need can matter to me. I can be aware of how I'm feeling and I can be longing for some relief from it. But the demand that it get met and the urgency to get relief are no longer powerful. They are now simply data that I'm using to calibrate an internal GPS that allows me to attune to myself and the other person more effectively in the service of collaborating, co-creating, and innovating. And part of what I've discovered in my own journey is getting really comfortable with being uncomfortable and being fine with my need doesn't have to get met in this way by this person at this time. right? Now, in order to survive and thrive, I certainly want to find places and relationships and ways in which I can meet my needs. But you are no longer my only strategy. And that gives some spaciousness in our interaction that previously wasn't there. I don't know if that relates, but there you go. I'm offering that in. So this morning we talked primarily about where we've come from, why this is challenging and difficult, why this is a difficult paradigm shift to make, because it's not the culture we live in. And for many of us, it's not the world that we see out there. And then we also talked about the 4 distinctions that NVC invites us to begin playing with, and the 4 dialectics that we start practicing, and the awareness work that we need to do, or that we're invited to do on the inside, in order to have more data and more information with which to navigate the strategies we might choose. This afternoon, I also want to talk about how we receive messages, and then we'll spend some time putting them all together in your situations. We won't be able to get into a whole bunch of dialogue work because we're doing a lot of map making today, just to sort of introduce you to the model. And I'll give you some options later on in the day if you want to deepen your practice with something like this. So are we ready to jump ahead, or was there anything else that somebody would like to say or ask before I do? So let's start with this. This invitation to start practicing observation, feeling, need, and request is my first skill building in being able to be empathic. Because if I don't have the ability to know from the inside out how something feels and what I might be needing, and I don't have any awareness of my own perspective and my own felt sense experience, and then the ability to sit with it, it is going to make it extremely difficult for me to be able to offer that to you. So my doing the work of practicing these things, developing a feelings literacy, developing a needs literacy, knowing what I want, is the the first step on the bridge that I'm trying to build to you. Because if you come to me with some pain that you are in, and it's pain that I am not in touch with in myself, then I'm going to other you. Do you know what I mean by other you? I'm going to make you something that is not me. So the foundation of nonviolent communication, compassionate communication, operating in this way in the world is the way in which I am able to empathize with you is because I know that pain in me, and I'm able to empathize with me. So when we go back to, I want to go back to the diagram we drew, at the beginning. The one where we're orienting to other and orienting to self, and we can end up in fighting, avoiding, accommodating, compromising would be here. Compromising, oh, whatever, there you go, compromising, fill in the correct spelling. And then what I would say is that true dialogue, collaboration, innovation, co-creation, whatever word you prefer, happens out here. And the tool of NVC invites us to, in a sense, bring together these opposites into a space of we. And so when we're dialoguing or attempting to communicate nonviolently, it's not me versus you. It's finding my connection with myself. I stop accommodating and losing connection with myself. The first practice is that I really deeply connect with myself, know myself. I matter to myself. I bring that knowledge and I use that to really connect with and understand you, and I hold a space of both. And it is in that space where I can hold both my perspective and an openness and willingness to hold your perspective that I have the internal resourcing to move towards a degree of mutuality, equality, intimacy, closeness, understanding, to meet some of those needs in relationship or in the workplace. I see a lot of heavy sighing with that. Put some words to that for me. What's happening in you as you hear that piece? Yes.
I just finished reading William Urey's The Power of the Positive No.
Yes.
And that's exactly what that is. It's in kind of an inverse way, or in a direct way. It's my truth is to say no to that, but it's no and, unless you have to say it, and we try to figure out how we can come together on something that meets both of our needs.
Yeah, yeah. So I'll springboard off that a little bit, that we have conflict with one another at the strategy level. I may have some strategies that I want, and you may have different strategies that you want, and we have conflict in the world at the strategy level. We do not, as human beings, have conflict on the need level. The reason that Marshall Rosenberg introduces them as universal human needs, and Mickey Cash then talks about them as the non-controversial essence, is because we are looking at those things, those internal motivators, that human beings across the planet, regardless of gender, age, culture, time in history, are motivated to fulfill more of in their lives. So there is not a person on the planet that does not have a need for a certain degree of safety and security in order to survive and thrive. Now, we will have a lot of conflict over our strategies for safety and security, and what we think the strategies should be to meet the need for safety and security, and that's where we're going to find conflict. But our shared reality begins on the level of we're not in disagreement, that we are trying to find the best way forward to get more safety and security in the world. So in the old frame, the one that most of us came out of, we're trained to think in terms of somebody has to have the right one, and and words are weapons. Okay? I have to convince you which one is the right one. And it pits us as human beings against one another. Internally, we are pitted against ourselves, and then externally, we are in conflict with one another, because that's the frame that many of us inherited. If we want to make a paradigm shift, we want to shift into the skillfulness of not seeing that you and I are at odds, that we both want safety and security in the world, and we want to find a way internally of getting to a place of willingness to work with one another. And in order to do that, we really hold that you matter plus I matter plus we matter. We are caring for the whole when we enter into a conversation. And that takes practice. At least it has for me. Because I will either lead with your perspective for you or my perspective and forget about your perspective. So for me, that has been a capacity building endeavor, to be able to do that, because it is not my habit. It is my deep intention, however, to get better at that and to stretch myself to be able to do more and more of that in the world. In this space up here, what happens in dialogue, I'll see that in a moment. What happens in dialogue is I am able to honestly express to you, if I'm going to use a nonviolent frame, my observations, my feelings, my needs, and my requests. I get very, very clear on what would help and what it is that I'm deeply wanting. And then, holding connection to myself internally, I then hear whatever you're going to say back, trying to hold my arm around both of us. and I'm going to talk in a moment, I'm going to take your question first, how we hear. What are the skills that we need in hearing? Because the skills we need in speaking, we went through this morning. Now we're going to talk about what skills do we need in order to hear it differently, because nobody else in the world is trying to speak to you like this. Okay, they're going to be their baddest selves again, as they always have been, and you're going to be receiving it differently. So before I go there, you had a question.
Not a question, but I would suggest that before we even recognize what our needs and feelings are, there's a lot of work to be done. Because what I might think is, for example, anger seems to be an umbrella term. I'm angry, or I'm not angry. And what I need is not to be angry. And it takes I think it takes a lot of honesty and deep work to recognize that this may not be fear, may
Okay.
be whatever. So
Yes.
before we even start there,
Yes.
there's a lot of preliminary work to be done. Because I think that by the time we reach adulthood, we have a certain idea of what we are and who we should be, and that's not necessarily what we really are.
I love you naming the fact that this is a practice of multiple layers. So there are 4 feelings that Marshall Rosenberg says we can work with very differently through a nonviolent communication frame. We call them like the 4 special feelings. Anger, depression, shame, and guilt. And I put these together because they have a more similar feel. Just very quickly, the way that we work with anger through the frame, through the tool of nonviolent communication, is that anger tells me that there's 2 things going on inside of me. One, I have a story that has some kind of a should attached to it. This shouldn't be happening. In some version, I've got a judgment and an evaluation that is active. And then I have an unmet need. When I put those 2 things together, there's an unmet need, and I'm adding a lot of should thinking about how things should be different. It'll generate anger. I'm sure many of you know the story of the 2 wolves, the Native American story about the 2 wolves on the inside and which one wins, the one that you feed. So reminding you of that story, if I attach to my story, I will get more angry. If I detach from my story and make a practice of connecting with my unmet need, it is more likely that the anger will shift to some version of fear, hurt, and grief. So when we scratch underneath the surface, there's a more tender feeling happening. It's not safe in our world. We have these beliefs that it's not safe in this dangerous world to show my fear or my hurt or my grief. So I learn to attach to my story because it's more socially acceptable in a domination system to be angry than to grieve. What I want to do with my story, this is not something to throw away. You could, for example, journal out your story and then figure out what is the deep vision that you are longing for. What is that vision in your story? And go and harvest that gem. Because there is something that is deeply, deeply important to you that you are imagining could be better in the world that you're wanting to fight for. And so it's important to then harvest what is that beautiful vision inside of me of the better world that I'm wanting to create. And then find a way of honoring the gem from the story while often grieving the unmet need. Because what's happening is, in situations of anger, is that I'm bumping up against the gap of how I long relationships to be in the world and the way that the world seems to be and the suffering that comes. And when I get in touch with the gap between how I'm experiencing things and how I long for things to be, There's grieving that we need to do. And if we don't know how to grieve, we're going to be angry. Parker Palmer, one of you mentioned Parker Palmer earlier on today. Parker Palmer says about violence that people become violent when they have nowhere to go with their suffering. So if we want to decrease violence in ourselves and others, we need to know what to do with our suffering, mine and yours and ours. And often it's an invitation to feeling some version of loss, sadness, hurt, and grief. And the culture that I live in, and I think many of you are in a similar culture, does not have a lot of ritual, tradition, crucibles, holding spaces for those emotions to be metabolized. So many of us are walking around angry. So I just want to offer that piece on the anger piece. Depression, shame, and guilt means, through this lens, that I've internalized everything that is wrong with me. And now I don't need any of you to tell me what is wrong with me anymore. It gets activated automatically on autopilot in my mind. And these, again, I'm super in touch with the judgments that I have of what is wrong with me. And I also have some deep needs that are unmet. Very often, the needs that are unmet in either one of these are for empathy. We're not getting enough empathy. And by empathic connection, I mean many of us do not have enough people in our lives who can sit with our feelings without getting anxious themselves. And that's back to the quote that I read you at the beginning of the day. We need a quality of being present to what is alive within us, with no demand to fix it, make it go away, change it. We need to be able to be present to ourselves and present to others. It allows us to metabolize the emotion and leads to clarity on the other end, because we get in touch with more data. Instead, internally, many of us have the experience of going through life constantly resisting. Resisting my feelings, resisting your feelings, resisting my ideas, resisting your ideas, resisting my demands, resisting your demands. It's exhausting. So these four feelings, the way that Marshall would talk about these, tell you about a combination of evaluation and judgment mixed with the unmet need. Back to the basic practice. Hold all of your story lightly and hold your needs tightly. Get down to the level of the needs and feel what you feel. The more you can do that, the less reactive you're going to be to anybody else feeling what they're feeling, because you'll have the capacity to stay non-reactive around it, because you're non-reactive with yourself. And by non-reactive, I don't mean numbed out, right? I know that's clear. I really do mean feel it, which is incredibly difficult for us human beings. You know, look at the amount of addictions in our culture of all kinds. We live in an extremely addicted culture. Tolerating uncomfortable feelings is not easy, in part because we do not have communities that are essentially empathic. You're familiar, I'm guessing, with the research that's been coming out on rats and addiction. Are people familiar with the latest research on rats and addiction? I'll summarize it really briefly for those of you that I can see are not. So this is a little bit oversimplified, but the addiction, part of some addiction models went back to they put a little white rat in a cage and they gave them food and cocaine in a lever, and then the rat would hit the cocaine lever and starve to death and die, and then they'd say, look how powerful these substances are. This rat will have the substance over the food and will die for the substance. Addiction is an incredibly powerful thing. Updated research is coming out where some really bright, enterprising graduate students decided, but you know what, how many rats live in a cage on their own like that? Let's put a whole bunch of rats in a more natural environment, in their family groups, in their communities, and we'll run the same experiment, but what will change is that we don't have a rat alone in a cage. They don't touch the cocaine. Okay? Now, I don't know. I think that may be an oversimplification. Go and read the research. I'm not trying to sort of, sensationalize this. But it speaks to me that we are looking for strategies to meet needs. And the needs, if we can begin honoring them, we can find ways that are, rife with well-being to meet those needs. And we cannot do it alone. We are mammals. We are community creatures. We need one another. We do these things in relationship with one another. So then this is an invitation to, when people show up in your life to have a relationship with you, what quality of relationship are you currently able to offer them and yourself? So if you'd like to be able to offer yourself and others more empathy and find others who are able to offer you and themselves more empathy, then I super recommend the tool of nonviolent communication to at least support you in resourcing yourself in that journey. Quick question on that. Any comments on that?
Yes. I used to know the melody, but I don't dare anymore.
Yes. And we all happen to be those people. We live in cultures of isolation and disconnection, and it's painful. And then we raise our children, and we tell them they need to get used to being isolated and disconnected because that's the way the world is. And we are doing damage on top of damage. It's not how people are meant to live, in my estimation. It's not what actually helps. So I'll get off my soapbox, and we'll get back to, thank you for bringing up the anger piece. When you scratch beneath the surface, this is a practice that will mushroom cloud out in multiple directions. So let me just kind of try and get back to how do we get into the space of we. I begin to see that everything that you are, I also am. Another thing that resources me in this journey, there is nothing that you can accuse me of anymore that I will deny. Okay? This makes a tremendous difference in every argument that I've been in my life. That when people, these other horrible people out there who don't speak nonviolently, and I used to evaluate as abusive and attacking and offensive and what I've discovered now after over 10 years of practice, very liberating. Yvette, you're so selfish. I probably am. Let me look at that. You're so narcissistic. Yeah, that must be my narcissism that came into play there somehow. Let me see if I can work with that differently. I can't believe how lazy and disorganized you are. Oh, yeah, lazy and disorganized. Yeah, I'm sure that's in me. When you realize that there is nothing that you can accuse somebody else of or that they can accuse you of that we do not all share, it is an extremely liberating place to get to. Because I no longer feel like I have to show up in every relationship as a good person. I simply expect myself to show up in my relationships as an imperfect human person doing what she can with what she knows and still has a long way to go. And when I can work with myself that way, there is a tremendous amount of soothing, relief, choicefulness, options that suddenly become available to me that have not been available to me every time that I feel like my sense of identity is being injured by your perception of me. Do you see how that can help you shift?
How can you do that?
It's taken a very long time. It's taken a really long time. This is where actually, Art, I'm so glad you said that because I want to bring in a little bit of neuroscience, okay? Because I sometimes find this neuroscience model helpful to myself. So I'll offer it to you. I don't know if it will be or not. I'm going to give you an extremely oversimplified version of the brain. There are doctors in the room, and so I need to qualify that I am not a neuroscientist, but take this as a metaphorical model that may or may not be helpful. Now you're going to see my fabulous brain drawing skills, yes? There you go, something like that. Isn't that fabulous? Okay, all right. Now again, you remember my map from earlier on in the day? Not to scale, not accurate. I really hope you can just sort of look at the concepts here. There are 4 distinct parts of the brain I want to talk about because they map onto how we work with NVC, and they also map onto the grid that I drew you earlier on. So your reptilian brain, the part of your brain, the brain stem that you share with mammals, with reptiles, responsible, Deepak Chopra once said, it's responsible for the 4 Fs: fighting, fleeing, freezing, and reproduction. So that's Deepak Chopra's who came up with that, not me, but I still enjoy it. Your brainstem is really part of it controls the autonomic nervous system. It puts you into fight, flight, freeze. So on the grid that I drew for you, it perceives danger. It's designed to scan the environment for danger, to put you into a fear reaction, and to put you into reptilian functioning. And so that's where we often find ourselves in interpersonal relationships if we're perceiving danger. If I'm very tied to being a good person with a particular set of identity features, and I'm really attached to you seeing me that way, then if we're interacting in a particular way and I'm beginning to get feedback that you don't see me the way I think you should see me, I'm perceiving danger psychologically. And I'll go into old, habitual fight, flight, freeze functioning with you interpersonally. So I'm just offering that, and I can give you some more resources for this piece. But that's this part of the brain. Then we have the limbic system. And the limbic system is the part that we share with mammals. And if we think a little bit about the way that mammals are different from reptiles, one of the primary ones is that mammals play. Reptiles don't play. How often is your need for play met in your life right now? It is a fundamental need. We need to play. We play with each other. We want to have playful relationships with one another. This comes out of this part of our functioning. We also live in community groups. The limbic system thinks in terms of tribes. Okay, who's in my tribe? Who's in my family group? Where do I belong? Here's where you get your needs for belonging. This one may have to do more with safety, predictability, belonging, play. I'm giving you a very shorthand version of this right now. It's not a comprehensive model. Then we get up into the neocortex, or the hemispheric brain, the one that has 2 hemispheres. We think of it as left and right brain. The part of the brain that is designed, even in its structure, for dualism, for breaking it into parts. And this is the piece of a lot of you earlier on that wanted to say, yes, that's good functioning, right? And I'm like, yes, that's good functioning. You're wired for it. You are wired to be able to break things into the pieces so that you can understand the parts. And that's very much the function of this part of the brain. It's very interested in patterns. It's very interested in information. It's very interested in data. And it's also the part of the brain that is generally, at least the left side for most people, verbal. So it's where we get language. The limbic system and the reptilian system don't really function as much with language. The neocortex does. Most important part that I want to talk about today is the prefrontal cortex. This part of our brain is the part that is interested in meaning and purpose and can envision things. It's the seat of your imagination. It's also a lot of executive functioning, but we're not going to go into that for purposes today. But it is the part of your brain that can imagine a future that does not yet exist. As you are imagining a way of being in dialogue with people that you haven't had a lot of experience with, your other part of your brain that really likes safety and predictability is going to have a bit of tension with this part that is saying, but look at how it could be different. And then all of these parts are going to say, that's not safe, nor is it predictable, nor is it familiar, and you're going to experience some sense of inner conflict. So I just want to map out that you're going to have a multi-layered experience as you're learning anything new, for good reason. The moment we are stressed out, the prefrontal lobe functioning goes offline to a great degree. And a lot of our resourcing shifts down into the fight, flight, freeze. And so knowing that this is happening, we can resource ourselves in relationships to relax. Get out of the constricted fight, I've got to activate and do in the world, which is from earlier brain systems.